Everyone knows now that we are recording. And again, I will be sending a link out to this session that will include the PowerPoint to everyone, and it will be available on our YouTube page. So again, welcome to HR to the Next Power presents Emotional Intelligence for HR Leaders. I'm Jess Rebar. I will be your kind of support, back-end support today. I'll be handling any questions that you guys have, or if you have any issues with tech, please feel free to send me a chat and I will, to the best of my ability, help you through those issues. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Merit HR Managing Partner and CEO, Danica Davis, to get us started with today's event. Take it away, Danica.
Thank you so much, Jess. I love these bi-monthly meetings, and especially since, well, a lot of you have your camera off, but I saw you, Mary Beth. I see your name there, Paul Costa. It's great to see so many familiar names, I guess, until we can see familiar faces. I am Danica Davis, and I am a recovering HR practitioner. Don't let everybody know that I did practice myself for a good long time. And I am a lifelong HR evangelist. The work of HR is so complex and impactful that it really is more of a calling than a profession, requiring an incredibly broad skill set and an approach that necessitates a commitment to lifelong learning, which is why we are all still here. I am thrilled that we are talking about emotional intelligence today. I started my HR career in the early 90s, right around when emotional intelligence was coming on the scene. And it was first appearing in the business literature. I mean, it existed before. Somebody in Harvard wrote about it, of course, but that was my first introduction to it. And I think it's a core concept to the practice of effective HR. While there are many EI models and a rather vast set of research around it, if you're interested in that type of thing, I was doing a review and found a comment in a 2004 study pretty compelling. And the authors posited that every organization is an emotional place because it is a human invention, serving human purposes and dependent on human beings to function. So hence my fascination as a human resources practitioner. Leading our discussion today on emotional intelligence is Susan Schwartz of the River Branch Group. Susan is an accomplished leadership coach and management consultant who uses emotional intelligence as a core element of her practice, particularly in helping highly technical people transition more effectively into leadership roles, but other applications there as well. She is an author and an adjunct faculty at several universities. Susan, welcome. I look forward to learning with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very good to be here. I always enjoy getting to share my passion for emotional intelligence and why I think it is such a strong, practical business tool. My background is technical. I used to design integrated voice and data systems for AT&T. I've worked in technology training for many years, and I was working for a global software company where my job was to bring 20 different training organizations together to work on a single newfangled blended learning platform. And what fascinated me, even though this was a technology company, what I realized was technology didn't drive business, people did. And I moved over to project management and leadership. And along that way, I started working with a project manager professional certification program. And I worked with the management and leadership part of that program. And I found that many of the technical people who were becoming project managers or were relatively experienced project managers didn't like the squishy leadership conversation. They said, I don't need to know that, it's technical. You know, I'm technical, why do I need to know it? And usually by the end of the 2 days, they figured it out. What I discovered was emotional intelligence and the assessment tool, and there are many. The one I like to use, the EQ 2.0 version, EQI 2.0, is that the assessment comes, and the report is in color-coded bar charts. And I interpret it using a normal curve. So all of a sudden we have data that helps people really understand. And because we talk about that technical hardcore information that's usually related to IQ, and now we're starting to speak about EQ, it's very common to confuse the two of them. IQ measures your ability for rote learning, that whole rote memorization. Your IQ is determined highest level when you're 18. That's when we take the college boards, and it's not that it decreases afterwards, it's going to stay the same. EQ measures your emotional intelligence. In fact, many of the experts within the industry don't even like to measure a person's emotional intelligence until they are 18. And emotional intelligence increases as your experience broadens, and as you grow and gain more experience, your EQ rises up. I like to call it wisdom. And then somewhere along the line, around age 62, it levels off. And, when I was taking my facilitator certification training, the person running the workshop said, "We don't know." Well, I do. By the time you're 62, you've been there, done that, and bought way too many t-shirts. And so that's where you start to level off. But if we take a step back and really look at what Daniel Goleman has to say, he talks about it being a multifaceted construct. It's a combination of empathy and motivation and decision-making, your interpersonal skills, your self-esteem. And so when we look at it, it all comes together, and it does. Emotional intelligence influences how you're going to work with employees, how you might advise those difficult clients, and how you handle stress and conflict in both your work life and your personal life. And we all know they're kind of blending together, especially as many of us are working from home in our kitchens and bedrooms and every place. So just before we move on, I want you to think about your favorite manager. What about that do you remember about that favorite manager? Think about it. Did they inspire you? Did they motivate you? Did they encourage creativity? I love asking people what makes a good leader. And what I love is the answer, no matter what, says, "I can't tell you, but I know one when I see one." So if we start to look, if we can go on to the next slide, all of the day-to-day tasks that HR professionals, other organization leaders have to perform to create successful organizations. And Danica referenced it. Business is personal. Nothing makes me more frustrated when I hear somebody say, "It's not personal, it's just business." I'm sure you must have heard it in your HR practice hundreds of times, especially when they're called into your office because they probably shouldn't have said it in that moment. But, to me, when somebody says it's not personal, it's just business, they're copping out. They are really copping out of their responsibility as a leader, because business is all about people. And that's what's really important, and why I really enjoy this image that emotional intelligence, I mentioned, it's very practical. It's not just an internal mechanism where you're just focusing on your emotional intelligence. We're looking at it as how you react to a challenge, and how the people who report to you, the people within your organization, how they react to challenges. And the toughest part about being a leader is being able to balance the two of those. So, when bad things happen, because they just do, you're stressing, but you can't let your team see that you're stressing. And if you recognize how they're stressing, then it's your job to kind of get them settled. And, as I say, the great secret among leaders is we're making it up as we go along, and nobody else can see that. So when crisis happens, you're looking at both inside and outside, and it's really important to recognize how you align with your team and make sure that your team aligns with the greater organization. It's probably, let's move on for a moment. This is one of my favorite studies. MHS Research polled 1,700 North American executives. They were all rated to be successful, all highly respected people. 21% of them attributed emotional intelligence to their success. And my question is, what about the other 79% of us? I'm an overachiever. I want that A. How much further can we all go? And as Danica was saying, there are many models, and people may define emotional intelligence differently, but I think most of the models do speak to creating trusted relationships, managing difficult conversations, being able to collaborate effectively, and removing those solution roadblocks. So we have a poll. Jess, are we going to put that up? Wonderful.
Just went ahead and launched that. So yeah, what do you guys think here?
Absolutely. And what it is I want you to choose one. All four of these are important. I can guarantee each of you, I'm probably come up with 2 or 3 more. So as HR managers and HR leaders, which one of these are most important to you? Do you think as you're coaching people and bringing people up, which of these do you think they should have?
And I'll leave this up for just a few more seconds. We have some, most of you have submitted already. So just 1 or 2 more seconds and then we'll.
Yeah, I see 72%.
Okay.
All right. Shall we see the results? So what's fascinating to me is that I thought it'd be a little more evened out, but more than 3/4 of the 80+ people here deem that building trust relationships is most important. And that really is intrinsic to emotional intelligence, and how I like to say that it's how you show up and how the people around you perceive you. So how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. And that's a little softer. That may be more difficult to develop. Managing difficult conversations, being able to collaborate, facilitate teamwork, and removing some of those roadblocks that prevent people from coming up with solutions. Those share that space really well. So let me ask you, when we're looking at these 4, before we go on to the next slide, can you ever have too much ability to build a trusted relationship? Can you ever manage too many difficult conversations? Do you ever have too much facilitative skill to help people collaborate? And do you ever need to remove too many roadblocks? Are you judged, your performance metrics at the end of the day? Or are they going to say, Danica, you are doing too much. You are just too busy removing roadblocks. You've got to work less. No. So let's move on. And I like to say that this is not Goldilocks. Emotional intelligence is not a Goldilocks story. I'm not sure, sometimes I'm in a room where not everybody knows that story. And just to make it brief, Goldilocks was a little girl that got lost in the forest. We're not going to think why she was alone. This didn't happen in the 21st century. Her parents just sort of, that's what little kids did in the 19th century. And she happened upon this little house, and she went in, and there were 3 bowls of porridge, and she was kind of hungry. So the first one she tasted was too hot. The second one she tasted was too cold. And the third one was just right. So when you think about emotional intelligence, you really can't have too much or too little. You know, you are who you are. And it's about how well you've developed those different traits. And it's about a balance. So there was a Harvard Business Review article, and the title was, "You can have too much emotional intelligence." And that's when the Goldilocks jumped in my head. And when I read the article, I had to see why would they say Harvard Business Review is, you know, a well-researched magazine. And it turns out that one of the executives they were working with, they said had too much empathy. And the criticism was that that person was letting her staff take advantage of her. Now, I think, and that's why I love emotional intelligence, because it's that multifaceted. There's lots of things that go together. The answer was she had a performance skills issue to work on. It wasn't a matter of having too much emotional intelligence. Or someone just said, I talked to yesterday, and they talked about emotional intelligence being a stress management tool. It's like, well, it does help you with stress, but it's so many layers. It's not just empathy. It's not just stress. They're all facets that work together in that. And so that's why, and people get excited, and I'm going to base it from the EQI 2.0 model. It's done on a normal curve. So if you have very well developed skills, you're going to fall to the right of it. And if you have some skills that could be better developed, you'll fall to the left of it. But it's all about a balance. My favorite job that I ever had was a product manager. It was a startup. I got to think outside the box, think of all these fabulous things. It was a startup. I had 90 days to build it and 90 days to make a profit. So I had to come up with this teeny little piece of it. Well, when I took this evaluation, my impulse control was pretty far to the left. My impulse control was not really well developed. And I tend to make really conservative decisions. And I saw on the right-hand side, my reality testing was very well developed. So I did need to think outside the box. There were reasons why that worked to my benefit. And what I did have that balanced me out was the strong sense of reality testing. So if I couldn't develop it in, 90 days, it didn't happen. If I couldn't define my client's pain point to make a profit in 90 days, it didn't happen. And I like to call this the bridge syndrome. I'm going to think about jumping off that bridge, but I don't, because I know it will hurt. And, on the other side, I was working with a customer service rep, and that person's most developed skill was impulse control. And everything else was right around the top. And I looked at it and started laughing. I shouldn't be laughing, it's not funny. She spent all day on the phone with people yelling at her. She was an incredibly successful customer service rep. And one of the reasons that made her successful is she didn't take it personally. She knew they had a challenge. She knew that they needed to let off steam. And so that's that impulse control. that she didn't latch back out at them. She held her tongue, let them do their business, and then she was ready. So depending on what you're doing and your responsibilities, that's how it all works out. So when we talk about how does emotional intelligence show up in the workplace, I like to say emotionally intelligent leaders, there are really 5 levels. There's the self-image, and that really is, I mentioned before, how you perceive yourself and how other people perceive you. I know there's been a lot of discussion about imposter syndrome lately. How often do people think you're fabulous and you only see what you don't know? You only see your faults. That's an example. One example, I was working with a mechanical engineer, and he was promoted because his leadership saw this great spark in him. And he didn't see that. He was fabulous. And when I was in my technical phase, I would have just enjoyed having a manager like him so much, but he lacked the confidence. He was even afraid to ask a question. He felt that he had to get permission every time before he made a decision, before he did something with his team. And then he would have to build up his confidence to get to ask that question. So as he developed more confidence, his self-image, his confidence, his capabilities expanded. And so that's when, looking at it in a very simplified view. Message clarity, that comes back to communications. That's how people see how we're showing up. And when you have a message clarity in communications, it's two-way. On the other hand, you need to pay attention who your audience is. I ran a workshop. There were a bunch of engineers who had to present budget cases to county commissioners. And there was one young engineer, very serious, very good at her job. She worked with water treatment plant, and she was very upset. Her manager said, go to this workshop because you've got to dumb down your message. Now, she was a master's degree in engineering. She worked with numbers all day long. She knew that if she messed up, people would die. It was the water. And she didn't know why the county commissioners didn't want to know why all of the details of her equations. And when she had to stop and we discussed, well, what is it that you're there for? You only have 5 minutes. She said, well, I need to get money for this project so we can make this happen. We said, okay, take a step back. Let's reframe the message that you're going to share with them. The light bulb went off and she left with confidence and a new ability to stop and think about reframing a message to reach her goal. People, I like to say that's how well we play in the sandbox together. So I wrote a book, and the best part about writing, a project manager's guide to becoming a leader is I got to ask everybody that I knew what made a good leader and, what was the one trait. And one of the stories that stood out for me was a friend who was a sales rep with a nationwide printer company. And in her office manager, he had a closed door policy. He walked in the morning, he closed his office door. If you weren't making a quota, you'd be invited in, and maybe every other week he'd have an office meeting. There was a senior VP that handled that whole geographic region. And he came in every 6 to 8 weeks, and he walked in the door. He'd stop at the receptionist's desk. He'd been coming for a while. He knew her children's names. He said hello. He spent about 2 minutes, and then he went on to each of the cubicles on his way back to the conference room. And at each cubicle, he'd say, good morning, how were they doing? If they had a sports trophy or something, they might make a couple seconds of small talk. The whole time allotted took 15 to 20 minutes. My friend, who just kept waiting for that office manager to move on to another office and bring somebody in who is a little more personable and motivating, said that if that senior VP ever asked her to do anything, she would go out of her way. He'd built loyalty, spending 2 minutes talking to each of 10 people, 20 minutes every 2 months. Is that a return on effort, let alone return on investment? Resilience. With resilience, I'll use my own example. Resilience talks about stress and how do you bounce back. One of the best lessons I ever learned, still to this day, when I was expecting my first daughter, I had worked my way into a staff job. You know, in my head, right when my daughter was born, the staff job would be over. I'd go back to my old office. Well, they stopped. They closed that office. They put all those operations back to a central location. And all of a sudden, I had to find another position, and I was 4 months pregnant. And I am honest to a fault. I went to interview with somebody, and it was great. He liked me. He knew my reputation. It was a super opportunity for me. And then I said, as he was offering me the job, I said, I do need to be honest. I need to tell you one thing. I have a slight problem. He said, what is it? I said, well, I'm 4 months pregnant. And he got this huge smile on his face. And he said, that's not a problem. It's a situation to manage. And so when you're resilient, you don't see problems, you see opportunities. And that comes along with flexibility. When you start to look at solutions, you know, bad things just happen. And you're constantly making decisions and having to rework your plans. And when you need to be creative, people make decisions differently. You know, if you can't tell, I'm one of those people that loves flip charts and sticky notes and running all through that. Other people like to calmly go back, think about 2 or 3 solutions on their own, and then come back together with a group of people, and they all very calmly look at the pros and cons of the decisions. And so you need to know the people working with you, what type of solution creator are they? And so that's where we look at these 5 levels, and it's truly a holistic approach, but it's very, very action oriented. On the next slide, I'm not going to go into it at all. It's a quick, this is a real snapshot of the very minute pieces of what you'll see in the EQI 2.0 model. You know, they're the 5 composites we mentioned, and then each of those have 3 sub-elements, sub-areas. And so when you go into it and you start to measure, it's like a puzzle. It's not a black and white. It's a very gray type of analysis, which makes it great fun. And at the last one in this segment is to look at a success story. When you look at how does emotionally intelligent behavior actually affect and impact the productivity of a workplace. And until 3 years ago, I lived in the Washington, D.C. area. I mentioned I was part of that project management curriculum. And I had written an emotional intelligence for leaders class that was an elective in that curriculum. And I had one of my students was a CEO of a federal government subcontractor, a IT subcontractor. So if you're not familiar with the federal government, think about a Silicon Valley startup. There is always a crisis. Nothing goes smoothly. It's not like the self-help books, start a company books tell you. There is always a crisis. And I saw him at an industry meeting a few months after the course, and he said, your workshop was my favorite workshop. And I said, why? You know, I'm not fishing, but tell me why. He said that what he learned was people handled stress differently. And he was about to fire. His plan was the workshop ended Thursday. Friday, he was going to fire his admin. I said, oh my gosh, why? And he said, she didn't get it. She did not get our business. And then he said, well, after your workshop, I realized that she probably handles stress differently than I do. And so I decided I could fire her next Friday or tomorrow, and it wouldn't really hurt my business. So he watched her for that week. And while he was flailing his arms and getting excited and jumping around, she was very quietly going back to her desk, going through her Rolodex, finding who could start to solve that problem, that challenge. And by the time this gentleman had stopped flailing his arms, the problem was halfway to being solved. And so when he realized what she was doing, instead of firing her, he gave her a raise. He gave her a raise because he saw how much her work, how important she was to the business, and he didn't want to lose her. So a lot about business and being that emotionally intelligent leader is paying attention to looking and observing the situation and then choosing how you want to react to that situation. And that's the power. One other quick success story, I did teach a class at Berkeley, and there was a young man in the international program from Chile, and he was an accounting manager for a shipping company. There's very small margin. The only way, the feature that the salespeople had to make a sale was to give longer terms. So they wanted to get 90 to 100-day payment, 120-day payment terms for their consultants. The accounting department, their staff did not get a bonus unless they could collect money in 30 or 60 days. So why do you think the accounting department was being hard-nosed about giving the salespeople permission to have longer? And they were just butting heads, and they would have arguments, and sales said accounting's, a sales stopper, and blame them for all the lost sales. When Alfonso went back to his company after the course was over, and he discussed some of the things, the learnings he had during his program, they were able to recognize that it was a matter of metrics. And he then received a promotion, and at 31 years of age became the person in charge of all vendor relationships in Central and South America. So paying attention and recognizing where there are challenges and looking for solutions is what makes emotionally intelligent behavior in the workplace. Should we move on?
Yep, let's do it. I think we've got an activity, but maybe let's, these seem to be a little bit of some new words here. So before we put everyone in the room.
And will you be putting this in the chat for people to be able to reference them?
Yes.
Thank you. So when we look at these 5 different categories, they come out of some of those 15, those individual that make up those larger components. So one of the subcategories, one of the 15 that's very, that I think is important is confidence. Authenticity, I think about walking the talk. Walking the talk. How often, as we're talking about important. If you say one thing and your actions say another, is that a way to build a positive, constructive relationship? So how, is authenticity something that's important? What about?
Yep. Yes.
Yep. So why don't we go to finish up, walk through a few more, and I believe there'll be a fair amount of time for questions.
Yep. All right.
Excellent. And I know I've said, I really think about emotional intelligence as a very practical tool that you are able to use to make to really influence a situation and allows you to take action to create the situation that you want. And when you start to think about an action-oriented emotional intelligence, it really is, Rita Carter was a science journalist, and her definition about emotional intelligence was that it wasn't about feelings that are intangible. These are about body-rooted, can we flip back, please? That it was body-rooted, thank you, survival mechanisms. And that lets us turn away from danger and propel us forward. I know several people in the breakouts were talking about stress and what you do when bad things happen, and it's nobody's fault. You can't blame people. You know, Brene Brown talks about a wheat field, and dysfunctional teams have to break apart and blame somebody, you know, give them a firing squad before they can come together and resolve the problem. And functional teams go right in the middle. They go, okay, something bad happened. It's nobody's fault. How do we fix it? And so that's what's happening here in this graphic is you get this feeling in your gut, in your heart. You know that something needs to be done. You move up into the logic area of your brain, you know, from the amygdala, your dragon brain, up to the front, where you have logic circuits. You filter that, and then you create action. And in between that, the lungs are right there in the center, because one of the first things to really engage that practical, emotionally intelligent leader that you are is to take 2 deep breaths. You know, that way you get oxygen to your brain, you calm things down, everybody else calms down. So your gut and your heart, that's that immediate visceral reaction. You're able to make better decisions because you've all taken a moment, settled things out, and the extra oxygen helps your brain think better, and therefore your actions will be more effective. And well, that's why I talk about it's really an action practical tool that's very helpful for people to use and really keep in their tool bag. If you wanted to go on to the next one. And so I mentioned this before, it can be very complex. I said there's 5 categories, 15 subcategories. There's lots of ways to interpret it. You want to balance the different traits. But you know what? If you can get started as soon as you leave this session. Please stay to the end. Anika and Jessica have done a great job putting it all together. It's really easy. Pay attention. If you just stop and pay attention to what's going on, what is the situation? You know, whenever there's a conflict between 2 people, there's 3 stories. Person A's story, person B's story, and then what actually happened. So take that moment and try to flesh out what actually is happening. And then if you want to expand on today's breakout, make a commitment to yourself. Decide what you spoke about, what skill you'd like to develop, and set a time and a place to practice. And think about how will you measure it. Richard Boyazzi, who works with Daniel Goleman, has a great meditation that when you're sitting in a car, I read this when I lived in DC, the traffic is not quite as bad as San Francisco. When you're sitting on the highway, you're sitting on the beltway, not doing anything else, start to think about, you know, what is it that you want to happen? Where are you actually? What's the gap? And how can you close that gap? So by the time you get out of traffic, you've got an action plan already to create that your initial goal, or that gap that you want to close. It could be a very small issue. It could be, how am I going to get all the carpools in one place? It could be a broader issue. It could be your professional development. But lots of things. Just take a moment, decide what you want to happen, Why can't you? Those roadblocks, how are you going to remove those roadblocks? And what actions can you take to get started? And it's about paying attention to your heart and your head and your actions. So I started coining a phrase that your intention was not received. So you have to pay attention to make sure your action is received, your communication with the intention that you met. So Danica, thank you very much. Did we want to?
I think we've got some questions coming and
Yes, we do.
from the audience, and thank you for sharing that. You know, so many times, especially those of us who are really solution-oriented HR people, don't always take that minute to figure, am I solving the right problem? And so awareness, which begins with self, then can also, then you're aware of others too. So paying attention is just crucial to anything we do, and certainly in this context. Jess, you've got some questions that have come in from folks. Do you
Yes, yes. So a lot of questions about, following up on what was discussed in breakout rooms, which is great. So a lot of questions about the impact that this COVID-19 pandemic has had on, just broadly speaking, emotional intelligence, but in the workplace, has it, are people showing to be more emotionally intelligent now that we've kind of all collectively gone through this thing together? Are there new, strategies being employed? Kind of just generally speak about what you're seeing with regard to COVID-19 and how that might have impacted any of this research or any of the findings that you've talked about here.
That is a good question, and it's one of those it depends type of answers. I think we have seen a broad range of reactions, and two pieces. One is that I have found a wonderful benefit is kindness and grace, and I think many of us are taking time to take that breath and to look at things through a slightly different lens. Behavior that you might have 3.5 years ago questioned, should that be going on, are starting to think about why is that happening, what else is going on in their lives. Because we've had to work remotely and now have hybrid situations, you have to work 3 times as hard when everybody's not in the same location. And when I worked, I worked globally before the internet. We had telephones. So there was always the call before the call, and then the call after the call. And so it's really been tough. I don't know how many of you have found that there's a lot more preparation and planning, trying to isolate where people are, what's important to them, and then having that meeting. And there's always somebody that might be shutting down. There might be somebody who didn't participate, perhaps somebody over participated. And then you need to have that meeting after the meeting to either find out what was left out or to calm some ruffled feathers. And so I think people, I mentioned that normal curve. It's very, emotional intelligence is very situational oriented. So if you took an assessment one day and you took it 2 months later after a very stressful moment, your emotional intelligence assessment that comes out of the report will look very, very different. One of the first workshops that I ran, I was so nervous because somebody had very engaged, very well developed skills in 4 of the areas. And when it came to the people part of it, that person was all the way over in the left-hand side. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got an axe murderer in my class. What am I going to do? How can I keep things going? And it turns out that just before he took the assessment, he had to fire somebody, and it wasn't very pretty. It was very difficult. And he left that meeting and came back and took the online assessment. If he had taken it that day of our class, we would have seen a totally different Jim. So I think that's what I enjoy so much, is that it catches you in that moment. And it really gives you that real view of what you're doing in that moment. And, and it will increase with that wisdom, from experience. So even though two people may be both very strong workers, someone is 32 and somebody is 48, just because of the experience level, that 48-year-old may have more well-developed, emotionally intelligent behavior. And it's what is unsaid and unseen. It's not very tangible when you're looking at those results. But it does depend. And, the COVID-19 has made it much more difficult. I do think we've all learned to pay attention better. And I think people, for the most part, have been able to engage and expand their strong, good, emotionally intelligent behavior. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and I think you also answered another question that I got, which was literally, can your EI change depending on the context or the place or the setting or the situation?
Absolutely. And so careful, if you think somebody's an axe murderer, just check it out.
Let's see, another question about kind of the flexibility of EI as it relates to cultural differences. Are there things that we should be mindful of or adjustments that we should make when interacting with cultures that are not, our own cultures in the workplace? It's a really a variety of people and understandings about lots of different things. So can you talk about EI and how it relates to kind of navigating cultural differences?
Oh, absolutely. And not to be a broken record, I'm going to flip back to the assessment tool that I use. And as you use that tool, you can compare that tool to a North American group of people. You can choose European, you can choose Asian Pacific type. So it's a global, it's able to address things globally. I think as we start to look at cultural differences, it still goes back to taking a step back and observing the situation, because there are different cultural norms. The mechanical engineer I was working with is relatively new to this country from the Middle East. And so how he works with other people in his division, he's still looking at his culture and his home country and the norms that he grew up with, and they're different from the North American, California, West Coast type of norms. And so that's part of the conversation, is how do you take where he is today? He's got lots of great skills, and how do we get him from point A to point B so that he's comfortable and confident in the workplace where he is there? But it comes back to paying attention and asking strong questions, and taking that breath and giving people grace as you figure out where they are and where they want to go.
So in keeping, and thank you everyone for all these questions, they're great. In keeping in along the same vein of, taking a step back and observing, I guess an actionable question is like, are there nonverbal cues that you can be mindful of when you're meeting someone and determining, you can't just slap everyone with an EI assessment every time you interact with them. Are there things that, like the layman, like me, I can walk out and just, start thinking about someone's EI or EQ based on how they interact nonverbally, or even just words that they say in a normal conversation?
Well, it's watching body behavior, really listening to what people and how people are saying. I'm sure nobody on this call behaves like that, but I mentioned that normal curve. And when you're very much to the right-hand side of that curve and you're looking at your self-regard, what that means is you have so much self-regard that you don't have time to pay attention to anybody else.
So if somebody seems really narcissistic, that says something to you about their level of emotional intelligence and how they relate to other people. So that's an extreme type of behavior. And other times, it's interesting because when you look at communications, and some people who are introverts make an assumption that their communication skills are less than someone who's an extrovert. And I kind of beg to differ. And I was, somebody came across and he was pretty far to the left of communication skills that needed to be developed. They were more oral type of skills. When it came to solving solutions and managing stress, he was one of those strong silent types. So even though he didn't speak a great deal, he was somebody that observed a situation, was really empathetic, and would speak when he had something to say. So that doesn't mean that he's not an effective person. So it is watching the body language, listening to them. Social responsibility is really about looking at your team and participating with the group's goals in mind. I worked with an analyst who is very, very introverted, and he's one of those people that are the strong silent type. He was he had very well developed social responsibility skill sets, and he was the team lead for a group of 6 people. And it demonstrated just how powerful his feeling was for the team. He was the team leader. He also, other times he let people speak, but as far as he was concerned, the needs of the team outweighed his needs. And so that's, that in that vein, he is incredible, has an incredible amount of emotional intelligence because of where he put his priorities. Is that helpful? Yeah,
I think so. And it's so funny. It's almost like you're queuing up these questions because you're mentioning words like group, right? And a question that came in is, can a whole group, like can your staff or your organization have an emotional intelligence score, or is it always just one person has this and then you take an average of all of those? Or can you have an emotionally intelligent team?
Yes. And what I find really fascinating is the 360 version of the assessment. You have the individual assessment, and then if you wanted to perform a 360 on somebody, it averages. You identify if you're the manager of that person. If you have 2 or 3, maybe that's above them in the organization, it gets averaged. If you only have 1, it just says manager. And but then your peers and your direct reports, it's an average. So it will say your direct reports, and it puts a line. So it'll say you're at point B, and your direct reports, or your point A, your direct reports might be at point B, your manager ranks you at C, and your colleagues rank you another way. And a real instance that happened, I was reviewing a 360, and this person had really great, in fact, her upper management and her peers recognized her with skills greater than she perceived herself. So she, say she gave herself a 90, they all gave her a 95 or 96. And this is just an average in life because we're used to those grades. Her colleagues that worked in other departments graded her less effectively than her upper management and her peers. And I mentioned that to the coach who was asking me to look at this because it confused her. And it turns out that that professional had a strong team this person would go to the ends of the earth for their team. However, they found it incredibly difficult to work across the team. They felt every time there was a request that they would have to stop doing what they were doing, and they didn't want to help them. That every, minute or help would take away from her team and their team. And I found that fascinating. But that's what came out of the 360. You really get some good data and how people show up and how their colleagues and their direct reports and their management see them. And my favorite feedback sessions to give is when the manager identifies them at much higher, performance rates than they do. And they kind of sit up straighter and they go, oh, I didn't know my manager thought that about me. And I can guarantee you that they started performing better right then because they had the confidence and they saw themselves in a different light. And so those are the fun 360s that when I get to evaluate those.
So I think we have room for maybe one, maybe two, depending on, we have about 10 minutes. And I know we want to give some information about resources and all that good stuff. But one last question here is, we talked about nonverbal cues and kind of assessing from a day-to-day perspective, but what about when your day-to-day is over Zoom? How do you manage to assess that or evaluate, or even you yourself be emotionally intelligent when you're talking to a computer screen?
What a great question. And then we all get zoomed out and I see a bunch of people whose screens are turned off. I think it works two ways. One, if you're leading the meeting, you do need to give grace because people do have children and pets, and some people I heard had to take a Zoom call in their bathroom because that was the only quiet place. And I always like to ask people, because I want to see their shining, smiling faces, to bring up their videos. And if they say it's broken today or my kids are all over the place, then we don't. And it is harder that you listen for voices, and you can learn a lot if you go out of your way for the people without video to ask them a question. I know sometimes the only face I can see is Danica. So I would probably send most of my questions or, communications to Danica and really watch her face. So my whole presentation is based on Danica's reaction. So it's really difficult, but I would need to speak with Mary Beth and Milan, and I would need to say, Mary Beth, how are you? What did you think of that? Or Milan, do you have any thoughts regarding that? So it works both ways. And what I have discovered is when I have some one-on-one meetings, I go ahead and I offer a phone call because it gives us all that visual break. And I also find we have deeper conversations because I'm only using one sense. I'm using my ears, and people relax, they're a little less on guard. So it's also good, I think, to mix that up a little bit. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. And this last question, I think, ties really great into us giving some resources. So a couple of people asked, if your emotional intelligence is so fluid, like how do you establish a baseline of that? Like, where do you start? Is there a test or a tool or a specific question that you can ask? How do you know where you're starting from?
Well, like I mentioned, there's the EQI 2.0 assessment. There's other assessment tools out there that can give you that, a psychometrically sound baseline. If you don't have the opportunity to do that, looking at Primal Leadership is one of my favorite books because it talks about applying leadership in the workplace. And he wrote it with Richard Boyapsi and Annie McKee. So it's really a well-rounded book. And so as you're reading through that, I think you'll be able to do some self-assessment. And some of these other books are also very good, and this gives you a different lens, a different perspective on what emotional intelligence is. And it could be as simple as writing down in the last week or in the last day, have you been in an uncomfortable situation? Have you had to think quickly on the spot? Has somebody asked you for some direct and honest feedback and you've been hesitant to give it? Those are the type of behaviors. If you stop and think about that, those will also help you think about how you might want to get from point A to point B.
Great. I think that's a lot of the same questions came in, but I think we've covered pretty much all of them. I think that was great. Danica, any closing remarks?
Yes, thank you so much, Susan, for spending time with us today and putting this together. We went through a lot of drafts, folks, because Susan is such a deep expert and had amazing charts and things like when we got it. This first session, we wanted to keep it fairly simple and introduce what is a simple and yet complex topic, right? And aren't all the good ones exactly that? They're concurrently simple and complex. And one of my favorite things about any model, and emotional intelligence is certainly a favorite one, is it gives a common vernacular for us to talk about these things. They are measurable. On that one slide, and you will be getting copies of this, it said questions like, how am I showing up, right? That's not diving into a whole bunch of science. That's something that you can use for yourself and as we help coach others. So it really is about awareness. It is about conscious effort on some of these things, talking with each other, reading some of these resources, and business is personal and people show up in different ways. And I do think, to parrot what you said, Susan, that one thing that we have learned is to have a little more grace with ourselves and each other through this time. And I am just so proud that there was one profession that always knew, no matter what the business, that it was about the people. So everyone, don't break your heart, but let's give ourselves a pat on the back. Knowing that from the very beginning, which is why we chose this fascinating work. Thank you again, Susan. Thank you, Jess, for being our moderator. And thank you all for participating today. Hope to see you next time.
And just one last reminder before we let you go for your day. Again, the recording will be available. I will be emailing that out to everyone who registered and participated. And if you do have just a minute, there's a couple of ways. We'd love your feedback. This is how we learn. This is how we grow. This is how we expand our the events that we do. We want to hear from you, what you want to talk about and learn about. So there's a QR code on your screen now. If you have a smartphone around, feel free to submit your feedback via a survey. I'm also going to send an email to everyone now that you can access that survey as well. And then again, look out for an email once we have this recording up on our YouTube channel. And please feel free to share this with your colleagues. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Fabulous.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, now that I found the buttons. Sorry, I got a little distracted on something else, and then I'm trying to find the buttons.
That's a line from Willy Wonka, button, where's the button?
Oh, I forgot. That's a great line. Susan
Well, I'm
Weber,
glad I'm in good company with Willy Wonka.
oh, it's great. It's great. great. Is Susan Weber
you
still
both.
there?
Thank you both. It was great.
Thank
Yes, I'm
you.
still here.
Well, undo your screen.
I'm sorry.
Open your video.
Open my.
Danica, I want to introduce
there we
you to
go.
Susan Weber.
Hello, Susan. Nice to meet you.
Hello.
So, you are not the Susan Weber that I know. Welcome. How are you? I beg your
I'm good,
pardon.
thank you.
There's a Susan Weber. I went to graduate school, and she spells her name exactly like you do.
Oh, how funny.
Yet thank you for, Susan Schwartz didn't even know you and said, put your camera on. And you complied. So thank you. You were not Susan Schwartz's friend from graduate school.
And yeah, no, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you now.
You too, thank you.
All right.
All right,
Well, have
everyone. I'm gonna close her down.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
day.
Bye.
Bye.